In tonight's Dorchester segment, we look at this week's election results as well as stories on housing and planning for climate change. To bring us up to date is the editor and publisher of the Dorchester Reporter, Bill Forry. Thank you much to have you back here once again in your old position.
Yeah,
Bill.
It's good to be back. Thanks.
Well, I want to start with the election and starting with the citywide story here, because the thing that we keep hearing about from people all over town is this turnout was dreadful.
Oh, it was. I mean, 11.1% was where it landed, and there was a question throughout the day as to whether or not it would break 10%. And that's really anemic. I mean, we've seen low turnouts before in a preliminary. I think 13% was the bottom of the barrel before this one. And then, of course, there was a year, I think it was 2013, where there wasn't a preliminary election at all because there just weren't enough candidates. And that's not great either. But to have part of the reason I think people were disappointed with this turnout is because this field was pretty good. The field of candidates was strong. There are several new faces emerging here as potential top place finishers or contenders, and there was a buzz also with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley moving into Congress from the council that somehow there was more energy this year. And you really can't call this an energetic turnout at all. To take nothing away from those who won on Tuesday, each campaign has their own work to do going forward. But for the electorate, I think it's it's not a great look. Put it that way.
Well, there were seats up for grabs in 3 of the 9 districts, but I guess if you compare that to last year, when I think the turnout was almost 25%, last year there was admittedly a lot more drama. In
2017, yeah, the last time there was a cycle for...
Or even just last year, in September of 2018.
Correct, yeah. So, part of what's different, obviously, this is an off year. There's no mayoral race to bring out more interest in picking a new mayor or somebody challenging Mayor Walsh, and so that's typical to see that kind of depression in voter turnout in the prelim. But again, it's pretty anemic, and it does I think beg the question as what could be done going forward to make this better. And there was no early voting this time, for instance. Other people are calling for longer duration blocks of voting time to give more people the opportunity. I think these things do need to be on the table going forward. This is a disappointing turnout.
Of course, that's what pundits were saying in 1995.
Yeah,
and,
I know it's.
And one of the interesting ideas from John Keller is that when you don't have an elected school committee, there's one less reason to vote. And I have to admit, as much as we like district diversity, there's not as much competition as there was when there were 9 people running at large.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, in this climate, I do think there's a trickle down from the national mood of politics being so toxic. It gets back to this local field, however, was not. It was the opposite of that. If anything, these are new folks with new ideas and generally speaking, get along very well. And there was a constructive council preliminary campaign. There was no vitriol here, but there was a lot of competition. And so I'm hopeful that this next round, there are several candidate forums scheduled. There's one in Dorchester on Tuesday that is being sponsored by the local civic associations. We didn't see a lot of that in the neighborhood prior for the prelim. And so I think there will be more interest and energy. Now that the field is winnowed to 8, these candidates maybe can get a little bit more attention.
One of the things I learned by comparing to the old days, especially going back to 1995, once again in that year the top vote getter was from Rosendale, but it was Dapper O'Neill.
Oh yeah, that guy. I remember Dapper O'Neill. Sure.
And the way he got people to vote for him, aside from demagoguery, was he showed up everywhere.
He did. I mean, he showed up. Full disclosure, he was at my grandmother's funeral.
He was at my father's wake.
I don't know if they had met. Yeah, right. So he made it a point to be out there, and he was at all the zoning board meetings. Coincidentally, I think they named the zoning board hearing room after Dapper O'Neill. So yeah, I mean, look, there's nothing more effective than an effective city councilor in his or her own way. Being out there, being engaged, and knowing their electorate, and he certainly did that. He had a far different base of voters and universe of voters than exists today in his day. But it's also changed that whole the social media, revolution, the way we're all digitized has really changed the way elected officials interact. Wakes and funerals aren't at the top of the pecking order anymore, and Twitter and Facebook, let's face it, are, and community meetings and other ways of interacting, but it's a different world.
And we also have to give credit to how the world has changed, because if you look at this other candidate from Rosendale who came in first place in the preliminary, Michelle Wu, it's a whole different story.
She's been very effective. I mean, to give Councillor Wu, credit, she's engaged. She's constantly engaging with her constituency online and in person and riding the train, and that seems to have been very effective. She won across the city on Tuesday. It was a performance not unlike her last one, where she topped the ticket with something on the order of 45,000 votes citywide. That was significantly lower this time. I think it was more like 25,000 because of this turnout being so low. But fully expect her to top the ticket in November, and she's winning in places where she's maybe previously a person with her profile wouldn't have, and she's winning across the board.
One thing I still see is this a big gap between the top fundraisers, in this case, Flaherty and Wu and Asabi George, and the rest of them.
Yeah, they're clustered at the top, and there's a bit of a drop off there. That we saw that last time as well, and of course in the last city council election, it was Councillor Wu, and then Councillor Presley, Councillor Flaherty, and then Councillor Asabi George. And then Althea Garrison, who of course is now Councillor Garrison, who finished in 5th and elevated to 4th or took a seat in council in January when Councillor Presley left. So she is technically an incumbent, but in many people's view, her fourth seat is kind of up for grabs. Councillor Garrison obviously has a shot at it too, but she finished in 6th place in Tuesday's balloting. The 4th place slot was grabbed by
Alejandra Saint-Guillen.
Yes, and so she had an impressive performance as well. And Julia Mejia, who lives in Dorchester and is another first-time candidate, finished in 5th, ahead of Councillor Garrison, and showed some significant strength in communities of color in particular.
And you have one more finalist from Dorchester, Erin Murphy.
Erin Murphy is from Dorchester. She finished in 7th, but she was clustered pretty close to the 5-6 finishers, and her campaign is saying that they feel like they're very much in contention. She was strongest in her native Dorchester, in Ward 16 in particular, and she's clearly doing very, very well there. She won several of the precincts in Ward 16 outright over the incumbents. She worked that part of town heavily, and in South Boston she did well. We'll see if she's able to grow that into other parts of the city over the next 5 weeks. That's a tall order, but for a first-time candidate, she acquitted herself well. And I'll mention that David Halbert, who finished in the 8th slot, also has a Dorchester pedigree and lives in Dorchester Mattapan line. Basically, he's out there as well. And I saw him on the weekend before the election. He's clearly got energy and has a message. So we'll see if this order of finish changes, and I expect it could.
This is Beyond the News. We're talking with Bill Forry from the Dorchester Reporter. Bill, turning to Dorchester news, like a lot of other parts of Boston, you have a housing problem out there, people getting displaced, at the same time people wanting to build things. It's all colliding near Upham's Corner. Tell us about what that.
Well, one of our front page stories this week, Chris, is about a meeting that happened on Monday evening in Upham's Corner involving a proposal for a new condo development on Dudley Street, 706 Dudley. It's a vacant lot, and it's been a vacant lot since I can remember. I mean, it's in a part of Upham's Corner that really could use an upgrade, and the proponent of this development is Gregory McCarthy, who's now the property owner. He also owns a property down the street at Humphrey Place, an apartment building. And what happened at this meeting on Monday night is he and his team made a presentation. It's a proposal for a 5-story, 26-unit condo complex. Sounds good and looks good on paper, actually. However, the neighbors came out and said, wait a minute, you're the landlord who's trying to evict everyone from your apartment building down the street.
And he says they're not paying rent there, too.
He does, and so there's obviously a dispute going on here. It's been going on. City Life Vida Urbana, which is a tenant advocacy group, is very deeply involved in that property. There's been a dispute for about what looks to be about 18 months, but it's unresolved. And so it really came to a head at this meeting on Monday night, where the Boston Planning and Development Agency is trying to build consensus around whether or not this project should get permitted or advance through the BPDA at least. And the answer from the community Monday night was no. And because this dispute, and what they feel is really a calculated campaign by this property owner to displace existing residents and build housing that's not affordable for them in large part. So it's really a case study in the sort of block by block changes that are happening and the political dynamics of that on the ground in real time. The outcome of this meeting was the BPDA planner who was running the meeting said, well, obviously, there's going to need to be more meetings now. It's clear that this project won't advance in the near term until there's more discussion and probably some resolution of that tenant dispute.
Well, given the ingredients that you just laid out, I see potential here for a deal. Give this fellow a generous zoning variance or two, and give the tenant advocate something, and it's all taken care of. But it's not as easy as that, maybe.
Well, it's certainly not going to be easy in this present climate. There's obviously a cloud over the ZBA for sure at City Hall. I think a lot of attention is now going to turn towards how do you come to resolution on a matter like this, and who are the parties involved? Advocacy groups like City Life and others like them have been around for decades doing this work, and oftentimes they are successful in arbitrating and advocating very, very well for their tenant groups. City Hall, however, has another agenda too, right? They want to build more housing. It's part of the agenda to try to accommodate this huge population growth we're seeing. But this is such a delicate balance there. I suspect that this is going to get hashed out outside of City Hall before it ever reaches a zoning board or even a BPDA hearing room.
We've got a couple of climate stories in this week's edition. One's about the climate-ready Dorchester project. You got water coming in places where it didn't come in so often before, isn't that right?
Right, and the projections are that's going to get worse. So the City of Boston, the Walsh administration, has engaged since 2017 in climate-ready Boston. They've started with East Boston for good reason, South Boston, downtown, and now they're turning to Dorchester, which of course has this large coastal area, places like Neponset, Columbia Point, Savin Hill, Port Norfolk, that are going to be impacted, of course, as if projections are correct. There'll be increased flooding, there'll be more frequent flooding. Places like Morrissey Boulevard, as we all know, are quite vulnerable often, and not just from storms, but from tidal events. So this is an effort to try to zero in now on what they're calling climate-ready Dorchester. This will be a series of meetings that began on Wednesday evening here in Dorchester and Neponset, and will continue throughout into the next year to try to get people to understand kind of the potential impacts and get some guidelines together on how to inform development and other planning, like things like the Morrissey Boulevard reconstruction project, which I tend to suspect is waiting for some of these decisions to be made.
Now, another thing you're keeping your eye on is in South Boston, but I'm sure it affects a lot of people in Dorchester, the Curly Recreation Center, and I guess this too has to do a bit with climate change.
It does a bit. Everybody probably knows it as L Street. A lot of people do, and its name is the Curly Community Center, and it's unique among city community centers in that it's right on the beach. It's at L Street Beach, M Street Beach. In Southie. It's heavily used by people from all over the city. It's got a Southie identity for sure, but people from Dorchester are there all the time, all points in the compass in the city. If you're a City of Boston resident, the basic membership there is $100 for the year, which is a great deal. The facility itself, though, is aged, right? It's I think from the 1930s, and it was built in that era when James Michael Curley was really the power behind it. It's an important facility. It is dated, and the Walsh administration wants to do a renovation project that's been earmarked at $15 million. The question comes to what's that going to do, and how disruptive could a renovation be there? Will they need to close the facility? There's buzz in the community that could be too disruptive for the people who depend upon it. So there's a meeting this Monday coming up, September 30th at 6 p.m. It's going to be held at the L Street at Curly Center, and I suspect it's going to be a full room. There's a lot of interest among the membership and the larger community as to what's going to happen.
We should mention also that if anything else comes up, you're going to have some feed on that. So how can people find it?
We'll be covering all these stories in an ongoing way at .news.com, and you can find us also on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @.news.
Thank you very much for being with us.
You bet.
Bill Forry from the Dorchester Reporter.